The Japanese soldiers were already inside the perimeter. The machine guns beside him had gone silent. The men around him were either wounded, dead, or fighting somewhere in the darkness where no one could see them. And Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone had a choice: stay where he was and try to survive, or leave the safety of his position, run directly into enemy fire, and risk everything to keep the line from collapsing. The decision would take only seconds, but those seconds would become the reason enemy soldiers later described him as something they could not understand. Not fearless, not invincible, something more disturbing. A man who had already decided what mattered more than staying alive. Before that night, Basilone was not a legend. He was a young man from New York who had found his way into the Marine Corps after serving briefly in the Army. He was not born different. He was not someone who believed he could not be killed. He understood death because he had spent years preparing to face it. But preparation creates a dangerous question. What happens when preparation is finally tested? Because the enemy facing Basilone that night believed they understood American soldiers. They believed every man had a breaking point. Every unit had a moment when fear became stronger than orders. Every army eventually reached the same human limit. Their mistake was assuming Basilone had not been trained beyond that limit. The Japanese assault came in darkness. The jungle around Guadalcanal hid movement, sound, and distance. For the men defending the position, certainty disappeared first. They could not see the enemy clearly. They could not know how many were coming. They could not know if help would arrive. The only thing they knew was that the line in front of them could not break. And then the weapons began failing. One machine gun position went down. Then another. Ammunition became the difference between holding the ground and losing it. For most soldiers, the decision would have been obvious. Protect yourself. Wait. Survive. But Basilone made another choice. He moved. He crossed open ground under fire to repair a disabled weapon. Then he moved again. When ammunition ran out, he ran through the same darkness the enemy was using for cover. Every step increased the chance that he would not return. Every step removed the possibility of safety. But he continued because the mission had become more important than the fear trying to stop him. And somewhere on that battlefield, an enemy soldier saw something that did not fit his understanding of war. The Americans were not fighting because they believed they would survive. They were fighting because survival was no longer the decision they were making. That was the moment the question changed. The enemy was no longer asking, "How strong are these soldiers?" They were asking, "What kind of person keeps moving when everything tells him to stop?" The answer had not been created on Guadalcanal. It had been created years earlier, long before Basilone entered combat. The Marine Corps had made a decision about what kind of men it needed. The Pacific was not going to be a war fought by armies moving across open fields. It would be fought across islands, through jungles, against fortified positions where communication would fail and commanders would disappear. The Marines understood something uncomfortable. A soldier who can only function when everything works perfectly is not prepared for war, because war destroys perfect conditions first. So they built their training around a different idea. Not simply obedience. Not simply endurance. Decision. The goal was not to create men who never felt fear. The goal was to create men who could still act while feeling it. Every recruit learned the same lesson in different forms. The body could reach exhaustion. The mind could demand surrender. The situation could become impossible. But the decision remained. Continue. Again and again. The Marine Corps forced future fighters toward the edge of their ability, not because suffering itself created strength, because familiarity with hardship removed the shock of hardship. The first time a man reached his limit would not be in combat. He would already know that place. He had been there before. And he had continued. The enemy would discover this difference one battlefield at a time. On Guadalcanal, Japanese forces attacked believing numbers and determination would break the Marines. Instead, they encountered something they had not expected. Men who continued after losing communication. Men who continued after losing leadership. Men who continued when the battlefield stopped making sense. The Japanese could understand courage. They could understand discipline. But they struggled to understand soldiers who could make decisions independently in chaos, because traditional armies depended on control. The Marines were designed for the moment when control disappeared. That was why Basilone mattered. He was not an exception. He was proof that the system had worked. One man, one weapon, one impossible choice. But the question remained, was Guadalcanal a unique moment? Or was this something deeper? The answer came when the Marines faced an even harsher test. Torretua. There. The conditions removed almost every advantage. The landing did not unfold as planned. The defenses remained. The casualties came quickly. Men reached the beach without the certainty that they would survive the next few minutes. This was the moment when many military theories predicted collapse. A unit loses communication. It loses officers. It loses information. Fear spreads. Movement stops. But the Marines continued. Not because the battlefield became easier. Because they had already been trained for the moment when it became impossible. The enemy kept searching for the explanation. Weapons. Training. Leadership. Each answer explained part of the story. None explained the whole thing. Because the most important weapon was not something carried. It was something built. By 1945, the final test waited on Iwo Jima. The island was designed to make every American advantage meaningless. The Japanese defenders were hidden underground. Every advance came with a cost. Every position had to be taken against an enemy who had prepared for months. For the Marines, the question was no longer whether they could win. The question was whether the human mind could continue accepting the price. Thousands of men would be wounded. Thousands would die. The enemy expected those losses to create hesitation. They expected human limits to appear, but the same pattern returned. The Marines kept moving. Not because they did not understand the cost. Because they did. That was what made the enemy's report so unusual. They were not describing men who were unaware of death. They were describing men who had already confronted it. Years after the war, Friedrichs, the German officer who had spent years studying armies, returned to the memory that had stayed with him. The men who came through the darkness. The men who seemed impossible to stop. At first, he believed he understood what he had witnessed. He thought they had accepted they were already dead. But later, he changed his conclusion. They had not given up on life. They had removed life as the only thing controlling their choices. That distinction was the mystery. The Marines were not powerful because they lacked fear. They were powerful because fear was no longer allowed to make the decision. The battles became famous. The flags became symbols. The victories became history. But those were only the visible moments. The real decision happened before any battlefield. Before Guadalcanal. Before Tariwa. Before Iwo Jima. Someone decided that the future battlefield would require a different kind of person. A person who could think when orders disappeared. A person who could move when certainty disappeared. A person who could choose responsibility when survival demanded surrender. John Basilwan's greatest moment was not created in the darkness of Guadalcanal. That moment only revealed what had already been built inside him. History remembers the battles. The enemy remembered the decision. Because wars are not changed only by the shots that are fired. They are changed by the human choices made before the first shot ever begins.